Right, this is the next lesson on industrial medicine in the year 1700 to 1900, looking at the last lesson in the prevention of disease, and this is a case study looking at John Snow, cholera and the Broad Street pump. And this was in 1854. Now, obviously, we've looked at events that happened after this, so we need to have a full understanding of how this event fits into the grand scheme of things, but also look at what role John Snow had in sort of changing the prevention of disease. This is the, as we mentioned before, the Edexcel specification scheme of learning, and at the very bottom bullet point there, you've got fighting cholera in London, attempts to prevent its spread, and the significance of Snow and the Broad Street pump. So what is cholera? Now what we've got here is a fact file on cholera. The symptoms, if you had cholera, then it would be, you'd have diarrhea and sickness, and also your skin would turn blue, hence why it was nicknamed the Blue Death. As I've previously mentioned, in terms of the level of diarrhea, it could be up to 20 litres, which means the cause of death would be dehydration. Death would usually occur 2 to 6 days after the person became sick. Your blood becomes thicker and it ruptures blood vessels under your skin. So cholera is a very pleasant way to go, and it was a disease which really did cause problems in industrial England, especially with the lack of hygienic methods. How's it spread? So it's spread from person to person, and it's spread through the water, which is contaminated by the feces of a sufferer, so the person's waste. It arrived in Britain in 1831 and made its way to London in 1832. And by the end of 1832, there were just over 5,000 deaths in London, and there were 3 further severe epidemics across the country over the following decades. And in terms of who was affected, it really didn't matter. I mean, wealthy people were affected too, but it didn't matter who you were. But you could argue that people in the poorest areas did struggle the most. So people in slums, workhouses, prisons and asylums. But what needs to be understood is that wealthy people were also affected by this disease. Now, this is before John Snow and the Broad Street pump, and people had ideas about what caused cholera. So most people thought that, number one, cholera was caused by miasma and rotting material which caused disease, which we know to be known as spontaneous generation. And councils and local populations focused on mess being one of the main causes. And the government encouraged cities setting up boards of health to provide clean water supplies. Now, by around this time, you should have an understanding that this is the first Public Health Act, which was not compulsory. But the key thing here is there was no real understanding on what caused this. Miasma was a very outdated idea. Spontaneous generation, we know later on, is proven to be wrong. But remember the time period this is, 1840s into 1850s. Germs had not been discovered yet. So that's a problem to try and find out what caused cholera. The actual germ for cholera wasn't found until 1883 by Robert Koch. Now, John Snow thought differently to what most people did about cholera. So John Snow observed cholera. He observed an epidemic in 1848 and wrote his theories down in a publication called On the Mode of Communication of Cholera. And he suggested in that theory that cholera was not transmitted by miasma as it affected the gut, not the lungs. So it affected your stomach, hence the diarrhea, and didn't affect your breathing, and it didn't cause respiratory problems. He also said that drinking water being contaminated by cholera-ridden feces in the city's drains, and this disease was spread by dirty drinking water. Now, by this time, obviously, he had his theories, but he needed to build up his evidence to be able to get people to listen. So this is where we talk about John Snow and the Broad Street pump. So what we just talked about there was before the Broad Street pump and the Soho epidemic. This is where we developed the work of John Snow. So in 1854, cholera broke out in Soho in London, where Snow lived. Now this prompted Snow to further investigate the 93 deaths which had occurred in Soho. And what John Snow did was he created a spot map to show where the deaths occurred in the area around Golden Square and Broad Street. So he went around to people's houses asking if someone had died of cholera there, and if they did, he spotted it on the map. Now, after looking at the map, once he went round the area of Golden Square and Broad Street around Soho, Snow realised that there was a general pattern and that the number of deaths seemed to centre around people who had drunk from the water pump in Broad Street. Now, there were a few anomalies in this, a few that didn't really fit. For example, there was a woman who lived several miles away from Broad Street who died of cholera, but Snow found out that she got the water delivered from the Broad Street pump because she liked the taste of it. So she was still using water from the Broad Street pump. There were also some cases that Snow looked at. So, for example, there was a factory near Broad Street which had been badly affected, with 18 people dying, but Snow identified that other people weren't affected. For example, workers in a local brewery, people that made beer, they didn't die because it turned out that they didn't drink water, they drank beer. So that didn't have cholera. To Snow, it was very clear that the water pump was the main reason why people were getting sick and dying of cholera. So what he did was he removed the handle from the pump, and what this did was it made the epidemic disappear just as quickly as it arrived. So by removing the pump, people couldn't get water and people could not die of cholera. Now, following this, closer inspections of the pump showed that it was close to a cesspit. Now, a cesspit is where people throw their waste into. And what was noticed was that there was a small crack in this cesspit, which means that the water and the waste from the cesspit was seeping into the drinking water of the Broad Street pump, so actually contaminating the Broad Street pump. So John Snow did his work, and his identification of why people got sick is really important. But we need to look at the impact. So before we get onto that, if you want to answer the questions on the work of John Snow, there's 5 questions there, and then you can develop the work of Snow before looking at what impact Snow had in the long run. So the impact of Snow. So in 1855, so a year after the epidemic, Snow presented his findings to the House of Commons Committee. So a group of individuals who had the power to be able to pass policy. Remember, 1855, we don't know about germ check. He showed his evidence to the House of Commons Committee and said that the government had to make improvements to the sewer system. He said it had to be done to stop another cholera outbreak. Now, the government agreed 20 years later, but it wasn't just because of Snow. So the government eventually began to develop more specific policies. 20 years later, don't forget, it's the Second Public Health Act. But they did start to develop sewerage and sewage systems before this. But it wasn't just because of Snow. As I've mentioned, in 1858, there was a very dry summer and it caused a great stink. The Thames was low and the sewage on the riverbanks began to smell because it was heating up. A lot of people say that it might have been a joint effort from Snow and the Great Stink that caused sewers to begin being built in 1860. However, many people rejected John Snow's work. Many people said that cholera was to happen, would happen to people even if they lived away from the pump. And the General Board of Health held on to this miasma theory. And a lot of people think this is because they thought that providing clean water would be very expensive. It could also be argued that without Louis Pasteur's idea of germ theory in 1861, that Snow's work wouldn't have been listened to. So 10 years after Snow died as well, Robert Koch found the bacteria for cholera. So was it the role of John Snow, or was it other people that made John Snow's ideas more valid? What is clear is that without John Snow, it's very difficult to have that argument. In the short term, it's very clear that John Snow's work had an impact in saving lives, but it wasn't hugely impactful in the long run, as it was down to the role of other individuals, Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and the government with the Public Health Act and the sewage building in 1860 and the Public Health Act of 75 that caused the bigger change in cholera. What is known is that the last cholera epidemic in England was in 1866. So by 1866, there had been significant change. Was John Snow important? Yes. Was he important in the grand picture of things? Possibly, but there are arguments to suggest that other people were more important.